Now, to get a view on the latest from Iran and how the country battles COVID-19 amidst the sanctions, we have asked Professor Syed Marandi, a world studies expert from the University of Tehran in Iran, to join us on Skype. Professor Marandi, it's always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Thank you very much for having me again.
First of all, do you want to talk to us about the latest death toll and the infection figures?
Well, what we have seen over the past few days is the stabilization of the figures. So we haven't had a rise in the numbers of new infections. It's more or less what we've been seeing over the last few days. And we've had a bit of a decline in the number of deaths or fatalities, fortunately. But it's still too early to be sure that we are entering a new phase. The government has, over the past few days, implemented a lockdown of sorts. People in each city can move around in the city, but they can't leave the provinces or the province that they live in. So, but most of the shops, for example, in Tehran are closed. Tomorrow is a major holiday in Iran. It's a day where people go out to parks. It's a tradition that's hundreds of years old, and the government is warning people not to go. And if people take their automobiles, they will be fined, and their cars will be taken, towed away. So the government is becoming more strict over the last few days in this regard.
So which provinces then are the most affected, and what does that tell us about the demographics there and the need to plan along those considerations?
Well, one of the interesting points is that the two provinces which were hit the hardest at first, meaning Qom and Gilan. Gilan is in the north of Iran. It's along the Caspian Sea. It's a forest area. They are now doing very well. Most of the provinces are gradually declining in their numbers, but a major problem is the city of Tehran itself, which is has a very huge population. It's between 10 and 15 million people, depending on how you calculate the city numbers, because some people work in Tehran during the day and leave at night. So a major city like Tehran, or the most important city being Tehran, is still a sensitive zone. But in general, hospital beds are increasingly being less filled by patients of the coronavirus. We have more people leaving the hospital than entering the hospital, so that is a good sign.
Now, with this trade exchanges mechanism, Professor, am I correct to assume that this move was actually by European countries to show that they are actually serious about alleviating the pain of the sanctions on Iran?
It is symbolic, although I wouldn't like to exaggerate its importance. The Europeans, as you know, are in violation of the nuclear deal. They have 11 key commitments that they began to violate as soon as Trump basically ordered them not to abide the agreement anymore. So for the last 2 years, the Europeans have been in full violation. They no longer purchase Iranian oil. They do not allow the Iranians to use the banking sector, even to import medicine or to import food, which is based on humanitarian law. They are supposed to do so, but they don't, under orders from Washington. And in general, they are in full violation of every element of all the different 11 commitments. But this particular mechanism, which has been devised, is in defiance of the wishes of the U.S. government. But of course, it's very small. It's a trade mechanism. It's sort of it's a barter where money that is put in there from Iranian exports is used to purchase goods to bring back to Iran. So it's not really very big. Only one deal has been carried through. It's roughly, I think, worth the equivalent of something like $400,000. It's not really very big, and it was used to, as you pointed out rightly, to purchase equipment for the fight against the coronavirus.
Well, it's quite interesting that you say that this move is in violation of certain Washington's policies on this matter. But then these mechanisms, I believe, will coordinate the import and export of goods, and so that cash between the partners are not handled by banks, thus drawing the ire of Washington.
Well, Iran already has certain similar mechanisms, not identical, but similar mechanisms with a host of different countries. So Iran does extensive trade with Iraq, with Turkey, with China especially. China and Iraq are Iran's two biggest trade partners. And so Iran is developing bilateral mechanisms with these different countries. And also a barter system is also being used where goods are exported and then other goods are imported. So there are different mechanisms being used, and actually the mechanism, this particular mechanism that the Europeans are using, is much less substantial in scope in comparison to, for example, what's going on between Iran and China. China continues to purchase Iranian oil, for example, in defiance of the United States. Of course, right now, Iran doesn't export very much oil, and the price of oil has gone down so much that it really doesn't mean much. And this actually, one of the ironies is that the sanctions that the Americans have imposed has detached Iran from the global economy. And so this crisis that is developing across the world really hasn't affected Iran much. And since the United States has denied the ability to export most of its oil, the collapse of oil prices doesn't affect Iran either. And so right now, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, they're all moving towards a crisis, whereas for Iran, it really doesn't have that much of an impact because Iran is out of the game.
So from a humanitarian point of view, so how much of an assistance would it have on Iran, given that the country is still battling with the coronavirus?
Not very important. I mean, Iran does import certain products and sort of equipment for the fight against the coronavirus. Most of its imports come from China, but increasingly Iran is producing its own goods. So now the kits that are used to detect the coronavirus are being produced in Iran by 6 different companies. And Iran is producing its own masks and its own shields, face shields, and so on. So Iran, one of the positive aspects of the sanctions, I must add, is that over the past few years, the Iranians have increasingly been developing indigenous industry instead of being dependent on imports. So Iran now has increasingly, I'm not saying it's an ideal situation, it's very difficult, but it's Iranians increasingly have the capacity to produce more and more different types of goods. And so I think that Iran's needs for importing goods to fight the coronavirus are decreasing. And I think that's something that South Africa should pursue as well, because this is going to be a very expensive year for the health sector in all countries.
Now, I'm reminded of a Parliament Speaker, Ali Larijani, last year when he said that, Iran does not care about European demands anymore because European governments have let it down in countering some hostile U.S. policies. So is this indicative of a totally different posture to the European governments now?
Well, this is a small commitment that the Europeans promised a long time ago. So it's basically a shift in Europe, although very slight, but some would say significant despite small, because it's in defiance of the United States. Everything is relative. It depends from which angle you look at it. But as things stand, the Iranians are no longer abiding by its commitments in the nuclear deal. It no longer imposes accepts any restrictions or limitations on research and development, and Iran no longer accepts those very extensive monitoring processes and mechanisms that were installed within the nuclear deal because the Europeans are in violation. So the Iranians, as you know, initially for a year and a half, they were implementing the deal in full despite the full violation of the Europeans. Then they gradually began to decrease their commitments to put pressure on the Europeans. And when that didn't work, basically Iran stopped all of the commitments that they were carrying out within the framework of the nuclear deal. But the Iranians still say today, as they are pursuing their nuclear program, their peaceful nuclear program, that if the Europeans do begin to implement their commitments, the Iranians will go back and begin implementing their side of the bargain.
Professor Syed Marandi, a world studies expert from the University of Tehran in Iran, thank you so much for your time. Much
Thank you for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure.